All right, Will, you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Hey, everyone, let's get this started. We usually like to intro and thank our speakers, but you all know who Will is, so if you can all just give Will Wright a big round of applause and thank him for showing up. So let's go. Will,
Testing?
no flash photography, no videotaping thing?
What?
Can you do the no flash photography?
Yeah. Can y'all hear me? Okay. Am I amplified? Oh, good. The voice of God. First of all, cell phones off, no photography, and fill out the registration forms that I'll remind you about later. And they maybe say all that stuff. So let's see. I want to start introducing Chris Trottier, who's going to help me with my presentation a little bit today. She's been working with me as a co-designer for about 5 years. And I'd like to start by also apologizing, first of all, to the translators, because I tend to go really fast, and because I always just want to cram so much into an hour. But if you can't keep up, feel free to just make up stuff, and it might be better than what I'm saying, who knows. Also want to apologize for the title of this talk in the description, which I know is kind of hopelessly vague. What usually happens every year is GDC, they call me up and they say, we want you to do a talk, and I say, okay, and then a week later they say, what's your talk about? And so then I think about it for a while, and I get a rough idea of what I'm going to talk about, and then I give them some kind of generic title in that area. That's what usually happens, but this year was different. This year, when they asked me what I was going to talk about, I just flat out lied. So I'm not really going to talk about the future of content. I'm really more, in fact, going to talk about a possible future of content. You know, it seems like the theme that I'm coming away from this conference with so far is that the next generation titles are going to be incredibly expensive. We're going to have to build mountains of content, and it's going to drive most of the smaller players out of the market. And I'd like to offer potentially an alternate vision of that. You know, I think that there is a way to deal with that more creatively. So maybe a more accurate title for this talk would be What I Learned About Content from The Sims. Now, you've probably heard me talk about this a bit, so we're going to do this a little fast. First of all, content is very expensive. This is a list of the content we had in The Sims 2. And compared to The Sims 1, it's just a mountain of work to make that stuff. Going back across the games I've worked on, looking at the teams scaling up. I showed you the slide last year if you saw my talk. If you look at the content side of that, it's growing disproportionately to the team size. So it's scaling up non-linearly. So it's trending way up, and I think that's kind of what we're hearing at this conference today. One problem with that is that for us to do twice as much content, it costs us about twice as much effort. But yet the value to the player really isn't twice as much. And this is just basic utility theory. If you're on a desert island and I give you an apple, it's worth a lot, to keep you from starving. Once you have 100 apples, the 101st apple is not worth that much. So I think, we're fighting kind of a losing battle here. On the other hand, we've seen that players love making content. Time and time again, every time we've given the players the opportunity to make content, they've just gone crazy with it. On our website for The Sims 2, we've already got something like 17,000 characters people have uploaded, 10,000 houses, et cetera. Now, obviously, not all this content is great, but even if only 5 or 10% of this is good, and in fact, the percentages are getting better, in terms of what's really good content the players are making, it still represents a huge amount of content that the players are willing to build for us. This is one of our larger websites, fan websites. They just had a celebration for their 100,000th object that people uploaded on there. Another thing we found from The Sims was that metrics can be extremely useful when you're doing games. We can learn so much from players by studying their play patterns, what they buy, what they do, the verbs they choose, that we can use for various purposes. We see that players hate boundaries. We're seeing a trend toward more open-ended games, especially unnatural boundaries where they just hit kind of an invisible wall in the game. One of the issues there is that as we try to scale up the size of the possibility space for the player, the development effort, again, is kind of a non-linear thing. To build an emergent game takes a lot of iteration. We're currently trying to kind of push that curve down a bit right now by building more emergent gameplay. And we need to also start fighting it on getting cheaper content development. I think there's kind of this inbuilt assumption that the amount of value that a player gets from content is probably a function of the quantity and the quality of it. We can take a title like Pikmin, and it doesn't have that much content, but it's very nice looking. And probably the area described there roughly equals the player value. We can take another game like Katamari Damacy, which has a lot of content, but a much lower quality. And it feels like about the same amount of value. So from that, I think we can kind of infer this gradient that we're kind of currently, when we think about the amount of content that we do in a game, we're falling somewhere in this gradient in terms of how much value we're providing to the player. I think this is missing a very important dimension, though. I think, the ownership that we can give players over content feels like a very meaningful new dimension. That, by pulling that out just a little bit, we, add tremendous amount of area to that player value. So maybe we don't need as much content, and it didn't need to be as high quality. If the player made it, they're really into it. This is my guy from Grand Theft Auto. His name's Mo. He doesn't really do the missions. He's kind of a slacker. He rides his bike all day and learns new little bike tricks on his bike. But I love it when he goes into the cutscenes. This guy's wearing his, cute underwear and his Barbie watch, and they take him very seriously in the game somehow. But, after I play the game, I go tell my daughter and my wife stories about what Mo did today, and, I find that, ownership over, the experience translates for me into much more meaningful stories. I never go tell somebody, the story about the cutscene I just saw in a game. But I'm always telling people about the weird, crazy thing I did that was very, unique to me. Very, I really owned the experience and I was driving the story. I was playing the story. And so I contend that player stories will always be more powerful than scripted stories that we try to tell the players. And I'll kind of revisit that a little bit later. So we've got these trends kind of going from, more linear gameplay to more open-ended, steeply rising content costs that we're fighting, the value of player-generated content, metrics that we can capture from the players. So perhaps a more accurate title for this talk today is going to be what I learned about content from The Sims and why it's driven me to procedural methods. Now, I started way back on the Apple II. Remember this? A great machine. And it was 6 times faster than a teletype. This is actually from one of their ads. Back then, we programmed everything, just, right down to the metal in, machine code. We actually had memory maps. We knew where everything was in memory, which is kind of cool. And actually, what was in memory, about half of it was code and about half of it was data. The memory was in such short supply that we had to, use as little data as absolutely possible. Today, that ratio is probably more like 100 to 1. Then this happened. CD-ROM came out, and at that point, compared to the amount of memory we were dealing with, and these little tiny floppy disk drives with 140K on them and stuff, this thing was, a supertanker. We could not conceive of this much data. Where in the world are we going to get all the data to fill this sucker up? And so the trend started moving toward, finding ways to create lots of data to pile into our games. And one of the games that kind of really exemplified this for me, well, actually, before I talk about that, this basically was kind of like the meteor that came in and sounded the death knell for the algorithm, in some sense. This is when data, started to really ascend and reign supreme, in our industry. And one of the games that really exemplified this for me was Myst, which was a very elaborate slideshow. It was actually done in HyperCard. Robin and Rand, I thought it was a brilliant game. I loved Myst. I loved all their games. And the fact that they managed to do this in HyperCard as a slideshow, but yet still make you immersed in this world, was absolutely remarkable to me. And one thing that always occurred to me, though, playing Myst, was that, there's this really cool immersive experience, but they had a great time building this world. And I kept thinking that over and over, boy, this is kind of fun to be in, but I wish I could have made this world. That was the fun part. Now, while the rest of the industry was kind of, going off into the data-driven, let's fill up a CD-ROM with lots and lots of content, there was actually kind of another tribe on the other side of the world that kind of kept the old ways. They basically worshiped the algorithm, kind of kept practicing their black arts. They adopted kind of modern dress and technology, and that tribe seems roughly centered on Northern Europe, Scandinavia, ground zero around Helsinki, and we call it the demo scene. And these guys are basically crazy. They'll take, these little tiny things at 64K and through algorithm generate huge amounts of animation and visual stuff and music and sound and just amazing things algorithmically, procedurally. And just to give you kind of some sense for how insane that is, if we take that 64K and we square it again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Okay, that's a CD-ROM over there. Okay. So, why in the world were they doing this? What was the point? They actually evolved out of the cracking community. They would crack games and then kind of sign their name, put a little screen at the front saying who cracked the game because it was kind of a, a little competition they had, and then eventually they got more animated, more elaborate visual. Eventually got very cool, you know, and if you haven't seen any of these, I really encourage you. And then they have these rituals. They get together and practice their black arts together. And anyway, I just kind of found this just incredibly inspiring over the last few years. So, probably a more accurate title of this talk is what I learned about content from The Sims, why it's driven me to procedural methods, and what I now plan to do with them. Okay, so the first thing I did was recruited an elite team of developers skilled in the old ways. Now, a slight tangent here, sorry. My daughter was 5, you know, many years ago, and I decided I was going to get a really nice telescope and a really nice microscope, you know, and I could find a telescope everywhere, you know, all these different science shops, nature company, places like that. And I went to go look for a really good microscope, and I couldn't find one anywhere, and it really surprised me. Because, you know, I'd used a really nice, like, stereoscope in school, and I really loved what you could do with these things. And this is just kind of, you know, Will's personal information you might find valuable. Really, you know, if I had to pick one of the two, I'd pick the microscope. You know, especially if you have a kid, these things are so cool to play with. And I'll tell you what you get, because now we have eBay. And on eBay, you can get these things very easily, whereas before, it was like a real treasure hunt to find one. You basically definitely want one with stereo and lighting, overhead lighting. And they come in 2 types. They come in low power and high power. And you want the low power. As counterintuitive as that sounds, I mean, and just, you'll put your hand into this thing and you'll spend an hour just obsessing over your hand, and it's like a religious experience. But anyway, back to our story. So we recruited this elite team of developers. Then I put them in a state-of-the-art hidden development facility, and started working on this thing a little while back. Now, what I'm going to show you today actually is a little bit of the results of what we've been working on. Normally, I don't really do demos, but actually, I really wanted to demo this first to this community, just because I feel so much affinity for this community rather than like an E3 marketing type thing. So what I'm going to show you, first of all, is very unfinished. It's kind of held together with, you know, baling wire and duct tape. Got a long way to go, but I think, you know, I can show you enough of it to where you'll get some sense of why I'm excited by procedural methods. And I think it is relevant to kind of, the, you know, what people have been seeing at the conference here today. We're calling it Spore. And that's where we're going to move over to this screen here. Okay, we start here, and we're in the land of the very small. I'm actually controlling this little guy around here. This is basically cellular scale. We have like some fluid dynamics. This basically is a very analog fluid version of Pac-Man. So basically, I'm trying to eat these little dots. These little bad things chase me. Certain ones, like these guys, can kill me too. Ah, that's bad. I have certain abilities in this world, but this world is pretty much entirely procedurally generated. Now, the abilities I get from this guy, after I eat enough little of these food pellets, I get to lay an egg. So that little yellow thing is my egg here. I now actually get to go to the next generation of the guy. I can click on the egg and go into an editor. If we could bring the lights down just a little bit, if that's possible. So here's a little editor. I have very simple parts that I can kind of build for this guy. I have mouthpieces that influence what I can eat. I can either eat filter food, or I have a proboscis I can poke into things. I have different movement methods, flagella, cilia, little jet, and weapons, like nemesis, spikes, whatever. So I'm going to take a little spike here, put it on the front of the guy, and then go back into the game. And I've actually modified this guy's abilities now. So whereas those brown things used to kill him, now he can go in and attack them. Now, I still can't go after the brown guys, but now I have a new food source. Now, I can change my movement and get faster. I can get stronger. So basically, the character that I'm controlling here is something that I've designed in the editor. Now, over time, as I'm playing this game, the camera kind of pulls out. The depth of field, you know, kind of reses down. This guy grows as it gets more complex. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit in his life cycle. What you're actually doing is you're playing through several generations here. And at every generation, you get the ability to go in and kind of modify it. So this is a bit later in the game. We've actually gone now from a 2D to a 3D environment. And now, rather than living in a little, you know, drop of water, we're living kind of under the ocean. Now, this entire world you see here is procedurally generated. Especially the guy, which I've created as a player. When I say procedural, I also kind of include player creating things, being very malleable in a procedural way. So for instance, the player creates his character, but the animations, behaviors, textures are all generated procedurally. Now this guy has a life cycle, very much like the little cell guy did. He also competes with other creatures in the environment. Another thing to realize here that's kind of different is that all the creatures in this environment are coming from other players. Look around here a little bit. You can swim over to those guys. Now, when I say coming from other players, what I mean is that they are asynchronously being sent to your computer to fill out your world. We're actually building a balanced ecosystem. Depending on what your world needs, we deliver other players' content to fill out that world around you. Now, like the cell game, this guy, when he reproduces, he lays an egg. Click on the egg, and now we go into the editor. Now, this is the editor for this guy. You can see he's kind of made out of parts. The editor here is roughly a mixture of kind of Mr. Potato Head, Erector Set, and clay. I can grab the parts and manipulate them. I can even kind of like pull them off, morph them. So I'll pull that off. I can grab the spine here, manipulate it. You see there's an underlying skeleton here, which gives me some clue as to kind of the internal structure of the guy. And like clay, I can roll the mouse wheel and actually sculpt him smoothly to give him his outer form. Now, these things are built out of functional parts that actually have meaning to the guy in terms of how he's going to behave and live in this world. These parts also are mutable. So let's pull off his tail here. The part categories come in functional divisions. So these are graspers. A lot of the parts also have some functional value besides their primary one. So that's a grasper as well as having a little bit of a weapon ability. But it's primarily grasper. This is a 3-jointed leg. Make it a little bit smaller. These are feet. So basically, I've taken my little swimmy guy. I can also scale the parts as I put them on. So I've taken my little swimmy guy and basically pulled his fins off, which is going to mean he's not going to swim too well now. I'll put, let's see, another leg there. So this guy is going to be a tripod guy. So the player can build like really unusual characters in here. The system will analyze what they built and then kind of bring it to life all procedurally. So we'll bring this guy back into the game. And because he lost his fins, he doesn't really swim too well now. So I'm going to actually have him kind of leave the ocean here. Now, the walking you see here is all procedurally generated based upon an analysis of the skeleton that you created. And in fact, every verb in the game is as well. And once again, the world you're seeing here is procedurally generated, other creatures coming from other players. Like the other levels, this guy has to kind of survive. This guy's a carnivore, so I'm going to have him eat. I'm going to have him come in and attack this guy. Now, the way he's fighting is based upon where I put his weapon, which is on his tail. Whoa. So you can see, if I'm not close enough, it won't hit. So I basically have to chase. Luckily, I'm faster than this guy. Oh, there we go. Get off my head. Yeah. OK, so we killed this little guy. Now we can actually start eating him. Now, one of the cool things about procedural verbs is that they can be cleanly mixed. For instance, I can tell this guy to take a bite out of this guy and then tell him to walk at the same time and use that to actually invent a new verb, which is to drag. One of the real wins, though, is that whatever I've created in this game is going to behave differently. I mean, it's just going to be fundamentally different behavior than anything that you might create in the game, which is a huge win. And, oh, OK, this is a bad guy. This is where you say, run away. Now, the game actually builds kind of a balanced ecosystem, so you're not always the top of the food chain here. On the other hand, this guy's kind of fast, and maybe has some amount of stealth, and maybe I can outrun these stupid little hoppy guys, and he'll go eat one of those guys instead. Let's see. I think I might be safe. Yeah, okay. So one of the next things that you do, basically you live out lifespan of one of these creatures, and then you basically mate, which earns you access to the editor, and you earn currency at this level of the game. So I can do a mating call. And try to find somebody to mate with. Okay, we'll see how that goes. And I'll kind of approach carefully. Yeah, that sounds good. Okay. Okay, and then we get to the procedural mating. Okay, enough of that silliness. Then we lay an egg, and that gives us access to the editor, where we get to create the next generation of creature. Now, I want to give you a little bit of a sense for how open-ended this really is. I'm going to load a few creatures that we've created in the editor, just to give you a sense for how creative the player can be with this. This guy, I call him Buttface, but you'll notice he has a rather non-standard leg configuration. But still, he moves very smoothly, very realistic, very lifelike. One little kind of subtle trick we're playing with here is that people have never seen Buttface before, so they don't know how he's supposed to move, as opposed to humans. Here's another one. Now, all the ones I'm showing you here are actually running the exact same script. This guy has got kind of a large head. I call him Tweety Bird. It's kind of like an SUV, or this is the Ford Explorer, like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I suspect he would have low fitness in the world. Let's see, this guy I call Hangdog. He's very cool. He kind of walks cool, too. But again, basically the same code running on all these things that analyze what the player's done and then kind of animates them, brings them to life. There's also a whole procedural texturing step that we don't have integrated into this. Like, I can't show you right now, but the ones in the world you saw that were procedurally textured. This guy I call Dilemma. So the function of these guys is a combination of the parts that you choose for them and also kind of the topological structure that you set up. So this guy just happens to have a very fast walking gait. And it's a property of kind of the way the procedural animation deals with that skeleton. So a lot of the kind of performance of these guys is going to be emergent, from the system. And of course, I insisted to the team that we had to do a Care Bear. So here's our Care Bear. I'm going to make him a really mean carnivore, But, so at any rate, that's our little evolution game so far. So one of the things we want to do with this editor here is to make it a toy. It's in line with the gameplay. When people were playing The Sims, they had to go out to a separate place, download a tool, do something with it, then upload it to a website. I want to burn the tools into the gameplay and then make the portability of the content transparent to the player. I don't have to go to a website and say, I want some cool creatures from my planet. They should come to me automatically. It should be able to analyze the way I'm playing and bring them to me automatically. I've seen a lot of evolution games, and most of them really did not, I didn't feel like I owned the creatures that were created because it was a very simple, pick from this set of parts or these 3 slots, head, body, tail, to kind of get that. As a kid, I grew up, just loving dinosaurs, and kind of the generation I'm from, that was like what kids did. And, even then, it was very much a paper, rock, scissors thing, By learning the different types and the names of the dinosaurs, it was kind of cool that I knew what an ankylosaurus was and my mother didn't. and that gave me a certain ownership over those. Today it's more likely something like Pokemon. These things, have very elaborate rule sets and structures that kids learn, and then, they feel some sense of mastery over these things. Now just imagine if they could create them, from scratch, and that's kind of what we're trying to do. Neopets as well. One thing that actually is amazing is that as you start giving these things properties, you start naturally mapping narrative into them. Going back to Care Bears for a second, they were, I don't know how many of you know, but they were originally just greeting cards. They were invented by American Greetings for greeting cards. If you're feeling bad, you give this Care Bear card, or if you're feeling, this way, you give that Care Bear card. They had very specific properties and specific friends and little superpowers and stuff. They're actually web apps. Right now, I filled out one of the little psychology apps that tells you which Care Bear you are. It turns out I'm Funshine Bear in the bottom corner there. And just when you think you've got all the Care Bears memorized, they go and invent Care Bear cousins, which they're not bears at all. They're all these weird things, except for that little yellow guy at the bottom. It looks like a bear with a tail. And they don't even live in the same place. They live in Forest of Feelings. The Care Bears live in Care-a-Lot. So the Care Bears are up here in Care-a-Lot, and apparently Forest of Feelings is below Care-a-Lot because when they fall off the cloud, they land there. And Earth is even below that because when they have to go on missions, they go all the way down to Earth, which would put them somewhere in like low Earth orbit. And they collectively refer to this as the kingdom of caring. And they never specifically say it, but they kind of imply that Earth is the kingdom of who gives a shit. Because that's where they always have to go on their missions. But I digress. Our lead artist, Ocean Quigley, kind of coined this phrase, artist in a box. We're looking at all the things that an artist would typically have to do to create content in a game and figure out, how can we possibly automate all these things? And then give, a very simple set of controls to the player to where they feel this incredible creative leverage. The stylistic dimension that we would like the players to kind of traverse is somewhere between like Pixar and Giger. I don't think we're going to get quite that far, but I think it's the right dimension. So we want players to be able to do like these kind of Dr. Seuss worlds or these very realistic kind of scary worlds in the game. In essence, what's happening is we have the player here manipulating a very simple little system, and that's their leverage on the thing. The computer takes that very simple little system that they've built and then generates out the much more elaborate data sets, the mesh, the textures. This is actually some of the procedural texturing that we're doing, where the player has control over which scripts run, and they can be combined to get a lot of really interesting results. And they actually analyze the topology of the mesh, so it knows where the back is and the belly and all this stuff. Also, the animations, which you saw, and then eventually the behavior of these things, which can be player-driven, as I was driving my little character around the world, or they can be NPC-driven. When I pull in other players' characters and they're living in my world, the computer is now controlling those things. Eventually, you get this very elaborate, cool-looking, realistic thing in the world. And what this represents, actually, is a creative amplification of the player's efforts. The computer is really an amplifier here, a creative amplifier on what the player's done. And if we look at how small we can actually compress these representations of, the stuff that I was doing in the creature editor could probably be compressed down to about 1K bytes. In memory, with animations and textures and all that stuff, it's more like 5 megabytes. And so that's something like a 5,000 to 1 compression. Now that buys us a lot of things. First of all, it gives the player the tremendous leverage creatively. It means that we can store a huge number of these things in a very small database. So even if you don't have a network connection, we can give you a little database on the CD with your game that contains tens of thousands of these things already if you're not connected to the net. It also gives us very low friction for moving these things. They're very cheap to move around from player to player, peer-to-peer or server host. And also, the same things that we do to give the player leverage are almost the exact same things you would want to do to build a generative system. The computer can be playing with those knobs just as well as the player. Very much like when somebody's making a face or a character in The Sims, they're doing sliders, it's going through some process, creating the finished content. And this is kind of basically mapping to the idea of a genotype, going through embryology to an eventual phenotype. And that compression is vital to this whole thing. And those levers, again, as I said, can be pushed either by the player or by some generative system. So the pollination that's happening here is as you build a creature, it actually gets sent up to our server. And this is one model. Actually, a lot of models could work here. It could be peer-to-peer as well, where we're sorting the best content and we're categorizing it. They're also categorized by things like their life cycle and how they behave in the world, how big they are, what they eat. So we can do parametric mapping to the content. In the meantime, your world kind of requests, we need people to fill out the world that I'm going to be competing with. and they get pulled in to build a little ecosystem around you. So that's basically kind of the pollination idea here, where the world is being built around you continuously as you play. Let me go back over here to the editor. Now there's one more palette at the bottom here, which is the brain palette. Now this is what you're really trying to do here, is you're trying to save away a little bit of funds as you're playing the game and slowly invest them in the brain. This is kind of like your college savings account. You know, a lot of times you're buying stuff, oh, I'm getting beat up, I'm going to buy better weapons, or I'm going to hide or run faster. But if you can save a little bit extra, you start investing it in the brain and you work your way up kind of this ladder. Now, once you get the highest level brain, your creatures actually become sentient, and you move to the next phase. Now, at this level, the game actually mutates from kind of a first-person eater to an RTS. Now we're controlling a whole little herd of these guys. Now, one thing that I talked about landmarks last time in my talk last year, and I'm going to show you just a few of the landmarks for me in the design. One of the landmarks is I've always been fascinated with the idea of monkeys with guns. And I don't know why, you know, but just what happens when you give monkeys guns, you know, it's just, there's something cool about that. So at this level, rather than, you know, the creature is now set. You've evolved the creature. But at this level, I could buy them tools. And in this case, I'm shopping for tools, and I'll talk about the shopping a little bit later. In this case, I'll buy them a spear rack. They get excited. We're seeing kind of more elaborate procedural verbs at this point. You know, they'll kind of have a response, decide what they want to do with it. I'm going to try now. Now, before they get into trouble, I'm going to buy them a campfire here. These guys are still a bit excitable. But I'm actually dealing with the social dynamics at this point. Depending on how they play them, they can become very emotional or very logical at this level of the game. Let me buy them a drum. Now, I bought them a drum, and now these guys have decided to start playing the drum. This is actually a procedural dance, you know, based upon my creature. Yeah. So at this level of the game, you're playing it kind of like Populous or something. I'm buying them tools. It's influencing what they can do. I can control groups of them now. I'll send them out on like hunting parties. And I'm, in fact, competing with other tribes. At this level, the ladder that I'm climbing is I'm really upgrading their hut. And so I'm going to buy them a better hut here, which will allow me to buy them better tools and also allow my tribe to grow. And I'm competing with other tribes for members. They have to do with food and stuff like that. Now, they're just basically living in this little corner of the world. I'm going to skip ahead a bit here. As I upgrade the hut here, eventually I upgrade it to the next level, which brings me to yet the next game, which is the city game. Now, at this level, we're basically playing a very, very simple version of SimCity. I can, you know, decide what buildings to make them. I build roads. They have needs. And basically, I'm trying to keep them happy in their little city. You know, and again, I have complete creative control over everything you see here. You know, so I am, you know, the player is the author of this little world. Now, like the tribal mode, we have a shopping thing here. Now, the shopping is populated actually, again, with other players' content. So if I don't feel like building something, you know, and I see something really cool that another player's made, it'll try to learn the style that I'm using and try to populate my shopping catalog with things in that style. And then I can pick them here and then buy it. Or, you know, if I see something I want to modify or I want to build something from scratch, I can actually go into the building editor. And we're trying to make you know, all the editors in the game feel very, very similar. This is using similar kind of morph block stuff. You know, basically everything in here has like a handle, and I can kind of play around with it, shape it, you know, like these little. We have categories, you know, from very platonic solids that have certain handles on them. Now, the building editor is a little bit closer to Legos, really. I can grab an object and I can have it intersect or stack. You know, we're trying to find the simplest possible operators the average person can very quickly learn, and this becomes a toy to them, that they really have a lot of time. And we found this a lot in the Sims build mode, by the way. The players would go into that mode. There was a little bit of a learning curve, but they had kind of immediate feedback, and they got so much creative reward for doing that. I've been looking at how we fold that experience more and more into the gameplay. Okay, so we basically added this little mushroom thing to our building. We'll go back in the game. There it is over here. So they're happy. They like it. The primary feedback for me in this game is kind of the happiness of my people, and now we're dealing with like large-scale kind of social interactions between the characters. As I mentioned before in the tribal game, this is my city, but I'm actually competing, with other cities. If I scroll across the map, I can look for neighbors. So here's another city. Now, this city was created in the exact same editor, just using, slightly different primitives, different texturing, from the procedural texturing. But just to give you a sense of the variety of style that a player can do. So our city was kind of, I would call it maybe Dr. Seuss style. This is more kind of techno-industrial Star Wars style. But these kind of demonstrate a little bit the kind of Pixar to Giger dimensions. Now these guys also will have a very different culture than my guys, depending on how we evolved and how I dealt with them, or how the computer dealt with these guys during evolution in tribal. These guys are really kind of more aggressive, a little bit more industrial. At some point, once you upgrade your city enough, you get the ability to start building vehicles. This is how the cities actually interact. At the tribal, you're actually sending people from tribe to tribe and doing raids or trading. You can have kind of good or bad relationships with the neighboring tribes. At the city level, we basically have kind of three ways to capture or ally with another city. They're basically military, economic, or cultural, depending on kind of the cultural flavor of my people. So they don't look very friendly, and they're heading our way. So we can open our vehicle editor, which works very much like the building editor. There's a shopping alternative populated with items that other players have created. And I'm just going to buy something here. Like that, we have parts categories. These have functional meaning, so propellers can help the thing fly. Certain things enable it to go into water or go on land. But I'm just going to go ahead and go for this goofy-looking thing. This is kind of more of a Nazca-looking. And there they go. Go God knows where. They're a little goofy. Yeah, go to that city. Go, go, go. No, not that way. Oh. Okay, so they're peaceful cowards, so it's hopeless. I don't know. In the meantime, these guys are, not looking real friendly. So this is kind of militaristic, but there are more peaceful avenues to kind of capturing cities. At this point in the game, we're actually kind of entering the what I call the civilization game. And this is a very simple version of a game like Civ or Risk. As we pull back now, for the first time, we can see the entire world, other cities. Now, one little trick you might notice here is that as I pull away from a city, it actually gets very exaggerated. This is both for aesthetic and functional reasons. Like, as I pull into the city, notice how it pops to a realistic scale, but as I pull out, it actually becomes an icon. That indicates actually the level of micromanagement. At this level, the city is one big button, and it has a very simple menu. If I want to go in and actually go in and still modify the cities, I'm still building Paris while they're attacking it, I can still zoom in and click the individual buildings and bring them into the editor and stuff. So basically, you play this game, the Civ, game, and slowly conquer the world, city by city, continent by continent, until pretty much you have owned this entire little world and built it on the way. So that's that. Now the next, let me just bring that down just a bit. Now, in this part of the game, we're dealing with a different type of pollination, as I mentioned. We have a buy mode in a lot of these levels. And here we're taking other players' content, trying to map it parametrically to your playstyle to populate your buy mode. Then, you might choose to buy one or actually build your own. When you buy something, though, we're actually using that as a positive feedback on what was in the database. So we're continually resorting the database on the top end, trying to discover the best feedback based upon how many players actually used it. And so there's continual sorting of all the content that we're accruing in the master database. At this point, you can see this game actually has some similarities to Wario Incorporated. In some sense, I wanted this to be an homage to all of my favorite strategy games. And I know it's kind of like one of the rules of thumb in a game is don't mix genres. And so I've always wanted to break that rule really badly. So, we basically have kind of the tide pool level, which feels very much like Pac-Man. That was kind of what Evolution, which is like Diablo, counterintuitively. And I say like Diablo because it's kind of like you go into this world and you hack and slay monsters, and if you make it out alive, you get to go back to the village and buy better armor, better sword, and then go out back and fight better monsters. And that's kind of the dynamic that you're going through when you're going to the editor, living through a generation, and then going back. The tribal level, really feels to me like Populous. I wanted it to be kind of an homage to Populous, which I loved. SimCity, of course, I had to. And then Civ, which I always loved. And I wanted the top, but I wanted it to be a very light game experience compared to what most of these games have turned into. I wanted it to be about 20% of the best of SimCity, or 20% of the best of Civilization. Because I, as a hardcore gamer, just don't have the time to invest in these games nowadays. I find myself spending a lot more time playing my Game Boy. I'd much rather have a lighter experience that distills all the core elements out. And so I'm fully expecting about 40% of this experience to be really aesthetic, that the player spends a lot of time just kind of building a creative world. And for them, it's part kind of light gameplay, but still very open-ended, very interesting strategies, but very understandable, simple systems that anybody can kind of pick up and play like they can play a Game Boy game. For every level, of course, we have an associated editor. That becomes kind of the main thing that you're interacting with, at that level. And really, I did not want to put the player in the role of, Luke Skywalker or Frodo Baggins. Instead, I wanted to put the player in the role of George Lucas or J.R. Tolkien or Dr. Seuss or whoever. I wanted the player to feel like, they had built an entire world, going through these different levels. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the story, just to deflect the issue, because I don't have enough time today to really go into the depth of it. But more recently, I've been thinking of story as really a side effect or a property of interesting experiences, not a prerequisite. So many games that had no story where I ran in and had a great story. I don't even know what the story of Grand Theft Auto was, but my story was really fun. I had a great time, and it was very, relevant to me. I own that story, and I know it wasn't, Star Wars or Hamlet or anything, but still, it was my story. I think we use the stories as a filtering process on our experience. They emphasize the causality of a situation. If you look at a movie, the director has the opportunity to show you exactly why this guy got upset and kicked this and broke his foot, And we don't necessarily have that level of control, from our side, but the player does. The player is always there, having the experience happening to them. Also, stories are very useful for portability, communication. It's a way for us to take an experience that we've had some other place, some other point in time, convey it to somebody else. And they're also, in some sense, a compression and abstraction where we can get general kind of lessons that we might apply to other situations. Even though the stories don't exactly match, we can abstract up the story to kind of schema learning. And I mentioned this actually last year a little bit. Robert Louis Stevenson, when he did Treasure Island, the first thing he did was draw a map of the island. And then his eye just roamed that map, kind of imagining all the things that could play out. And in some sense, the story just kind of emerged to him. So let me go back over here. So here's our little toy world again. Now I wanted this to feel like a very clock-like toy world. So you'll notice it actually is very exaggerated, but in a kind of a stylistic way. I'm going to go back to our little city here, see how they're doing. Looks like we have a crater where that building used to be. In the vehicle editor, there's one more slot that over time we can eventually unlock as we're playing through the game. We started with ground vehicles, water, air, underwater, and at this point, I can now buy what we call the UFO. And I'm just going to buy a stock one. I could have brought this in the vehicle editor as well. Now, this basically becomes your Swiss Army knife at this point. This becomes the representation of all your kind of tools and abilities in the game. This guy is very fast, very mobile. He can go anywhere on the planet in no time at all. Now, there was another landmark that really kind of inspired me at this level. Just a little short side story here. There was this show I used to watch as a kid all the time. It was called The Mutual of Omaha's Wildlife Kingdom. How many of you saw that show? Oh, yeah. So it had Marlon Perkins and this other dude, I forgot his name. But they would go around, every episode was them saving some wild endangered animal, or studying it or something. But what I loved about the show was that every week almost, the way that they chose to solve the problem, their environmental problem, almost always involved a high-powered tranquilizer gun and a helicopter. And so I'd watch the whole show just for the scene at the end where the guy's in the helicopter hanging out, trying to get, going through the herd, nabbing the guy. So that was something that I really wanted with my UFO here. And so the UFO really, one of the things it is, it's a content creation tool. So I can go around looking for something. Let's see. Oh, these are the guys that were beating up on us way back. Now it's time for us to get our revenge. Okay, if I can get over to them. This is a little tricky. Whoa, got him. Yes. So here, this is basically a little abduction beam. And that guy's too fast for me. Oh, I don't want a tank. No way. I can get that guy. Oh, man, they're hard to get. Well, I guess one will do. So I can use this to go around the world sucking up content. And as you might have guessed, I can also use my UFO to kind of go further out, and further out, and further out, and further out, and further out. So here's our little local solar system. A few comets, there's our sun. We have hot planets near the sun. This is our home planet that we actually evolved on. And then way out here, we have some cold planets. We can click on any planet, kind of go over to it, and we can actually take our UFO there to investigate. These planets really represent like little sandboxes for the player. So as we pull up to this moon, you notice geologically it's very different than where we came from, than our home planet. It's much further away from the sun. Now, one of the things I want to do with this thing is I actually want to kind of bootstrap it up to life, and basically build a whole flourishing, civilization on this. And I might do a very different style too. So you can view these as like different palettes that I have to work with. So one of the things I want to do is I want to try to get life on this planet to live and kind of bootstrap it up. I'm going to come down to the surface here, really quick. Now, I'm going to try dropping that guy I just picked up. Can anybody tell me why that happened? If we can bring up the volume a little bit on this machine. Yeah, that's good. So we had a little problem there, and we have no atmosphere. Okay. So what we really want to do is we want to make this world livable. Now, at this level, another one of my kind of landmarks was an old thing called KidPix. How many of you played KidPix? I wanted this to feel like KidPix, basically. What I loved about KidPix is you had all these cool, weird, wacky, creative tools, and they were always out of your control. I mean, you always did these unexpected, oops, I didn't mean to do that type of thing. And I wanted the terraforming to kind of feel like that as well. So I'll pick one of my terraforming tools. And these are things that you earn for the UFO. You're actually increasing your UFO's ability over time, and there are lots and lots of tools with different ladders. So we'll fire a little volcano tool. And so this is actually sculpting the surface of the planet directly. And pumping atmosphere in there. Now, over time, these will actually start developing a thicker and thicker atmosphere on the planet. But in the meantime, I can actually start building colonies here, even while I'm waiting for that. So, pick a spot, zoom in. When I build a colony now at this point, I get kind of the style that I had on my home world. But it has a bubble over it. This, by the way, is also what I would get if I were to build, at this point, a city underwater. So at this point, at this level of technology, I can start colonizing the oceans on my home planet, and they would have bubbles as well. Now, this kind of takes a while. Now, once I terraform the planet, I won't need to build bubble cities, and I can actually build very elaborate kind of colonies that are earning me money to help me upgrade my UFO. That's kind of the real loop going on here. We have a little cheat here. This is at the very high levels of the game. You'll eventually be able to afford the what we call the Genesis device. So this will very rapidly, if you notice the ground texture, you'll see things are starting to green up a bit. We're getting a little bit of atmosphere. As the storm clouds pull back a bit. So we are actually trying to bootstrap up the atmosphere, and then there's the biosphere score. So once you get a little bit of atmosphere, you start then bringing in plants, probably that you've harvested from your home planet. And then you can actually start living there. So it's like a kind of a three-way colonization game, terraforming game. But really, we want players to be extremely creative kind of with what they build here. So let's pull away from this guy. So now it's kind of green. Now it's a happy little place. Now our guy's there. So everything's good. As I mentioned, the UFO has a lot of different levels that you can advance on, the different tools that you add. One of the more expensive things that you really have to kind of work in here for a while and build some usable colonies, earn a lot of money, but eventually you earn the interstellar drive. And so we pull out again. Now this is our home planet here. We call this the stellar zoo. In fact, we want to have all the real things that you would see in space. One thing that's always really annoyed me about the way astronomy is presented is it's presented as two-dimensional. If you look at star maps like that, I mean, that's the way astronomy is taught. But yet it's this beautifully three-dimensional thing, and you just are not given the sense of what that's like. We have these beautiful images from Hubble, and we're never given any context for how big they are, where they live, how frequent we see them in space. And I really wanted to, at this level, give a player a real sense of what it feels like to be out in the galaxy. So we have things like black holes back here. We have planetary nebula, and this is basically an old supernova shell. These very bright stars are like blue giants, and in fact are going to go supernova fairly soon, so I have to kind of stay away from those. So there's actually a terrain here to this. This is a Missum nebula back here, where new stars are formed. But also at this level, we have a SETI tool. I can roll the mouse over different planets and listen to them. If I'm listening for radio chatter, I'm actually trying to discover other intelligence. Oh, there we go. I think it was that one. There we go. Yeah, it's in an alien language, but I now know that there are aliens living there. So we can go visit that star now. So this is a different system that we're in. Looks like they had a little accident or something here. This is another race. Now this is the point at which I am overtly browsing other players' worlds, okay? So this entire world was created by another player, and now the computer, it's downloaded to my machine, and I want to emphasize this is asynchronous. It's not a simultaneous multiplayer game. I download it from the other player, and the computer takes over control based upon the personality sliders that the other players kind of set for it when they evolved it. So let's go visit these guys. This is kind of a little hot planet because it's so close to the sun. You can see it has kind of a very different geology. Very arid. Very large sun there. Looks like they have a big city over here. We'll kind of approach slowly. Now, when we're doing first contact with the other species, you have to kind of play this little close encounters musical game with them to try and establish a language. And they may or may not respond well, depending on how you play it. So I'll try that now. Okay, but luckily we have defensive tools as well. So this is Space Invaders. My weapons are seeming a little ineffectual against them. But as I mentioned, all of our tools in the UFO come in many different flavors. So. So there go our friends, and there goes my reputation as a nonviolent game developer. But we made a new ring. It was a nice crafts project. So I'll just pull out to here again. We're going to leave this place. There's nothing more to see here. Move away now. OK, so at this level, the space level, we actually want to build a set of metagames around, basically my favorite genres of science fiction. Each one of these is going to be a metagame at this level, starting with something like War of the Worlds, kind of an adult supervision, Peacemaker, Day of the Earth Stood Still type scenarios. Uplift, where I go to worlds that have just primitive creatures. I can drop down a monolith, and basically come back later and see how they've evolved to intelligence to see those worlds. First Contact, abduction and crossbreeding, of course. You'll have free access to most of the editors at that point. So at this point, I can go back into the creature editor for free and make weird alien, hybrids. And diplomacy. Every race is going to have its own kind of personality. We're actually using the Star Trek races as kind of landmarks, making sure that we get, with the smallest number of dimensions, we can clearly distinguish between all these races, so that when I go up and interact, and I have like the Klingons versus the Borg, or my versions of these things, that they should behave appropriately with each other. These don't want to fight or trade or just be good friends and share, cool ideas, whatever. We want the space game to really feel very, very open-ended, and this is where I think most of the narrative is going to come into the game. I want the players to feel like they're creating these worlds. If you look at some of the old comic book covers from the 30s and 40s, that's what I want the players to feel like they can make these worlds of this variety. If you look at these covers, they mostly, they have vehicles, buildings, aliens, and planets. So all the different things that we have editors for are represented on these covers. This is some of the concept art we did for trying to get a sense of how broad we think players can build worlds aesthetically. Now, the pollination at this level is that we're actually doing overt browsing. I'm actually going to another player's entire planet. When I'm on the planet, I can actually, abduct their creatures, steal vehicles, and they enter my library. I can use their creatures to go back and populate like an entire zoo planet if I choose to. So really, we have these different levels of gameplay. And the overall structure of the game now is that of a T. That we're going up through evolution, through all these different levels, and then we have these very broad set of metagames above it at the space level. And this is actually a little bit opposite than most games, because what we're doing here is we're putting the more goal-oriented gaming first as the tutorial for the eventual sandbox, which will then surf down through all these levels. In most games, you think about it, the sandbox is kind of the tutorial. That's where you learn to play the game, and then you go play the real goal-oriented game. We're using the goal-oriented game to basically train you to use all the editors and to teach you the simulation dynamics at every level, so that by the time you get to the space game, you can kind of fractally surf, both horizontally, from planet to planet, and vertically, from like city to civ to tribal. So eventually, with the players creating all these different worlds here, pull out a little bit more. Now, the region we were in was like this little square here. I think we can actually create a whole galaxy here of, tens, hundreds of thousands of worlds that the player can visit and interact with and kind of make up their own game along the way. This was, you might kind of notice this was an idea I've had a long time ago was Powers of 10. I've always been a big fan of the Eameses. But I never, in my mind, could figure out a way to kind of roll this into a game and actually make it all add up. More recently, I started working on a SETI game because I was very fascinated with the SETI and astrobiology programs. One thing I noticed at some point, though, was that the interesting terms of Drake's equation, and this is the equation about, a galaxy has this many stars, and this percentage of them have planets, and this percentage of them have life. The terms in that equation map very neatly to the different powers of scale. And so at some point I rolled the two up, the SETI game and the Powers of 10 thing. This is actually one of the first design doc, which Wired about a year ago asked me to do a page for them. They said, we're doing an issue on life, and will you lay out a page for us? And I said, sure, can I do whatever I want? And they said, yeah, and I just sent them this. I didn't tell them what it was. And they published it last year. So the design docs have been out in Wired for a year now. So the very simple player story here, and we needed a way to kind of, compress this whole idea so that people can comprehend it, is that the player is going from bacteria to a galactic god. And that we're kind of basically trying to, replay, the complete history and future of life, which it's hard to come up with a really kind of catchy marketing line for that. If anybody comes up with one, let me know, please. Now, the hub that all of this revolves around, and I haven't had much time today to go into the details, but the hub this really revolves around is compression, as I mentioned. The compression gives us tremendous leverage for the player to make them creative, which is a huge win for the player. It also, that same leverage, gives us generative systems, which we can use to populate huge content libraries. Also, it makes the content very portable that we can use to build an unbounded world around the player, which is, again, is a huge win. We did over 200 prototypes of this. In fact, I've shown many of the prototypes for this over the years. I just didn't tell you what they were. But prototyping has become kind of a religion for us around this. And one last thing I wanted to say here. As we were working on this game, a lot of the games I've worked on, I've always hit obstacles, usually trying to, to convince other people it's a good idea or be sellable or whatever. When I look back on this idea, the biggest obstacle I truly had was making myself believe that we could build the game. It was my own imagination was the biggest bottleneck. Once I truly believed that this game was buildable, it proved to be actually quite easy to to persuade the rest of the of my staff and the executives and everything that we could do it. So I'd encourage all of you, if you've got like some totally weird idea that is just so far outside the box that you think, there's no way that would work, go back occasionally and revisit those ideas because, you just never know, where they might lead to. And last thing is I can't talk about this again until E3. I'm sorry. I got special permission to talk about this today here, but I can't say a word of it outside this hall after this until E3. But that's it. Thank you very much. I think that went well. Wow, that's inspiring. What's that?
You can keep clapping.
Actually,